We don't need some old man telling us how to do our jobs. The young crew chief's voice cut through the hangar like a knife, dismissive and sharp. The C-5M Super Galaxy sat massive and silent on the tarmac, its nose doors sealed shut like a vault, refusing every attempt to open them. And standing there, weathered hands in the pockets of his worn jacket, was a man in his 70s who'd just offered to help. A man they'd just turned away without a second glance. If you believe experience deserves respect, type honor in the comments. The morning had started routinely enough at Dover Air Force Base. The C-5M Super Galaxy, one of the largest military transport aircraft in the world, had touched down after a transatlantic cargo run. Standard procedure called for opening the massive nose doors to begin the unloading process. These weren't ordinary doors. Standing nearly 5 stories tall and weighing thousands of pounds, they opened upward and forward, transforming the front of the aircraft into a gaping mouth that could swallow tanks, helicopters, and humanitarian supplies with equal ease. But today, something was wrong. The hydraulic systems hummed and strained, but the doors wouldn't budge. Not an inch. The flight crew tried everything in the manual. They recycled the hydraulics. They checked the electrical systems. They ran diagnostics that came back green across the board. Everything said those doors should open, but they remained stubbornly, inexplicably sealed. That's when the old man appeared. His name was Frank Morrison, though nobody on that tarmac knew it yet. He'd been visiting the base, a routine pilgrimage he made every few months to watch the big birds land and take off. 73 years old with silver hair and a slight limp from an old injury, Frank looked like any other retired civilian who'd wandered over from the observation area. His jacket was faded, his jeans worn at the knees. Nothing about his appearance suggested he had any business near a multi-million-dollar aircraft. He'd watched the crew struggle for nearly an hour before he finally approached the security perimeter and called out to one of the airmen. "I might be able to help with that," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind. The young airman barely glanced at him. "Sir, you need to stay behind the line. This is a restricted area." Frank nodded slowly, pulling a laminated card from his wallet. "I understand, but I worked on these planes. I know something that might—" "Sir, please step back." The tone left no room for discussion. The situation on the tarmac was escalating. What had started as a minor inconvenience was rapidly becoming a crisis. Inside the cargo hold of the C-5M sat time-sensitive medical supplies destined for a field hospital in Germany. Every minute those doors stayed closed was a minute that equipment wasn't reaching surgeons who needed it. The base commander had been notified. Senior maintenance officers were being called in from their weekend leave. Someone suggested bringing in a crane crew to try forcing the doors open, a suggestion that was quickly shot down as too dangerous. The aircraft represented a billion-dollar asset that couldn't be damaged. Meanwhile, theories multiplied. Maybe the locking pins had engaged incorrectly. Maybe there was ice in the mechanism despite the mild weather. Maybe some computer system had failed in a way the diagnostics couldn't detect. The crew chief, a tech sergeant named Martinez with 8 years of experience on C-5 variants, was growing increasingly frustrated. He'd never seen anything like this. And standing at the security line, still trying to get someone's attention, was Frank Morrison. Finally, a senior master sergeant named Williams noticed the commotion at the perimeter. He walked over, irritation evident in his stride. "What's the problem here?" The young airman jerked his thumb at Frank. "This civilian keeps insisting he can help with the aircraft, Sergeant." Williams turned to Frank with barely concealed impatience. "Sir, we appreciate your interest, but this is a military operation. We have trained professionals handling the situation." Frank met his eyes steadily. "I'm sure you do, Sergeant, but those doors have a manual override that's not in the current technical manuals. It was a feature we built in during the original design phase, just in case the hydraulics and electronics both failed. I was part of the engineering team at Lockheed." Williams' expression didn't change. "That's great, sir, But unless you have current credentials and clearance, I can't let you near that aircraft. Now please step back." Frank nodded again, that same patient nod, and returned to his position behind the line. But he didn't leave. An hour became 2. The base commander arrived in person, his face tight with concern. A conference call was set up with Lockheed Martin's engineering support team. They were sending someone from their facility in Georgia, but it would take hours. The medical supplies were now critically delayed. Tension rippled through the assembled crew like electricity. That's when Captain Jennifer Hayes arrived on scene. She was the base's logistics officer, and she was furious about the delay. But she was also thorough. She wanted to know everything that had been tried, every theory that had been explored. During the briefing, someone mentioned the old civilian who'd claimed he could help. "Where is he?" she demanded. Williams gestured dismissively toward the perimeter. "Some retiree who says he worked on these planes back in the day. Probably just wants attention." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "Did you get his name?" Williams paused, realizing he hadn't. "No, ma'am. Get him over here, now." It wasn't a request. Frank Morrison was escorted to the captain, who extended her hand professionally. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. I'm Captain Hayes. I understand you have experience with this aircraft." Frank shook her hand with a grip that was still surprisingly firm. "Not this specific variant, Captain, but I was a senior design engineer on the original C-5 Galaxy program. Started in 1968. I worked on the nose door mechanism specifically." Around them, the assembled crew had gone silent. 1968. That was over 50 years ago. Hayes studied his face carefully. "Can I see some identification, sir?" Frank pulled out his wallet again, this time extracting an old Lockheed Martin employee badge, yellowed with age but still readable. Then he showed his military retiree ID. "Captain, United States Air Force, retired." Then, from a protective sleeve, he carefully withdrew an old photograph. It showed a much younger Frank standing in front of a C-5 Galaxy prototype, surrounded by other engineers in short-sleeved white shirts and narrow ties, the fashion of a different era. Hayes looked at the photo, then at Frank, then at the massive aircraft behind them. "What do you need?" Frank walked toward the C-5M with a purpose that hadn't been there before, his limp somehow less pronounced. The crowd of airmen and officers parted, watching this old man approach their stricken aircraft like he owned it. He stopped at the base of the nose, running his hand along the fuselage with the familiarity of a man greeting an old friend. "The hydraulics are trying to push the doors up and forward, right?" he asked. Martinez nodded. "Yes, sir, but they won't move." Frank pointed to a small panel near the lower left side of the nose, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. "Open that panel. Inside, you'll find a manual release. It's not in your current manuals because it was considered obsolete after the first 50 aircraft, but the C-5M is built on the same basic airframe. If I'm right, it's still there." Martinez looked at Captain Hayes, who nodded. Within seconds, tools were produced and the panel was removed, and there, exactly where Frank said it would be, was a red mechanical lever that none of them had ever seen before. "When we designed this system," Frank continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher, "we worried about a scenario exactly like this. What if the hydraulics powered up, but the doors were somehow held by another system? The electronics wouldn't detect it because from their perspective, everything is working fine. The hydraulics can't overcome it because they're fighting against lockout pins that weren't supposed to engage on the ground." He pointed at the lever. "That releases those pins directly. But here's the trick. You need to pull it while someone inside the cargo hold pushes the manual release button for the main hydraulics at the exact same time. The timing window is about 3 seconds. Martinez immediately called for someone to get inside the aircraft. A young airman sprinted up the rear ramp into the cargo hold, reaching the cockpit area where the backup controls were located. Radio communications were established. Frank positioned himself by the lever. his hand gripping it firmly. "On my mark," he said into the radio. 3, 2, 1. Mark. He pulled the lever with both hands, years of rust and disuse making it grind against itself. Inside, the airmen hit the button. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deep mechanical groan that echoed across the tarmac, the massive nose doors shuddered. Hydraulics engaged with renewed purpose. Slowly, majestically, the doors began to rise, opening like the mouth of some enormous beast waking from sleep. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Captain Hayes stood beside Frank as the crew began the unloading process, finally able to access the critical medical supplies. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "why didn't you push harder to help earlier?" Frank watched the organized chaos of the unloading operation with satisfaction. "Captain, I spent 30 years in the Air Force before I worked for Lockheed. I know how the chain of command works. I know that protocols exist for good reasons. I wasn't going to force my way in or make a scene." He smiled slightly. Besides, someone smart was bound to ask eventually. She shook her head in wonder. "How many of these are you? How many people with knowledge like this are we dismissing because they're not in uniform anymore?" Frank's expression grew more serious. "More than you'd think, Captain. Every generation builds on what came before. But sometimes we forget to ask the people who laid the foundation. They're at air shows, they're at museum volunteer days, they're at base open houses, and they remember things that never made it into the updated manuals." The base commander approached, having been briefed on what happened. He extended his hand to Frank, and his handshake was followed by a salute that Frank returned crisply, decades of muscle memory taking over. "Sir, on behalf of Dover Air Force Base, thank you. You've saved us significant time and potentially saved lives with those medical supplies." Frank accepted the thanks with characteristic modesty, but his eyes were bright. The story of the old veteran who opened the unstoppable doors spread through the base within hours. By evening, it had reached social media, shared by airmen who'd witnessed it firsthand. By the next day, Frank Morrison received a call from Lockheed Martin's Historical Engineering Division asking if he'd be willing to participate in a review of legacy systems and undocumented features across their aircraft lines. He agreed immediately. More importantly, Dover Air Force Base implemented a new protocol, maintaining relationships with retired personnel who'd worked on or with their aircraft, creating a registry of institutional knowledge that existed outside the official manuals. Frank became the first entry in that registry. He returned to the base not as a visitor watching from the perimeter, but as a consultant, welcomed and respected. The young crew chief, Martinez, made a point of personally apologizing to Frank for the initial dismissal. Frank waved it off with characteristic grace, but he also took the opportunity to teach Martinez about the dozen other little-known quirks and features of the sieve that hadn't made it into modern documentation. That conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from emergency backup systems to optimal loading configurations that reduced stress on the airframe. Knowledge passing from one generation to the next, the way it should be. Several months later, when another C-5 experienced a different mechanical issue, Martinez remembered something Frank had mentioned in passing. He tried it. It worked. He called Frank to thank him. Frank just laughed and said, "That's why we write this stuff down." The lesson from that day at Dover Air Force Base echoes far beyond one stuck door on one aircraft. In our rush to embrace the new, to trust only the digital and the documented, we sometimes forget that wisdom doesn't retire when people do. Experience doesn't disappear just because it's carried in the mind of someone whose uniform is decades old. Frank Morrison didn't demand respect or recognition. He simply offered what he knew when it was needed, with the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent a lifetime in service. And when he was finally heard, he delivered exactly what was required, nothing more. The real victory wasn't just opening those doors. It was the moment when a system designed to protect and maintain protocols learned to also value the human knowledge that exists outside those protocols. It was a base full of young professionals realizing that the old veteran at the fence line wasn't a curious bystander, but a walking library of solutions to problems they hadn't even encountered yet. Frank still visits Dover regularly. But now, when he arrives, he's greeted by name at the gate, and his car is waved through to the visitor parking with recognition and respect. Sometimes he gives informal lectures. Sometimes he just walks the flight line, watching the massive aircraft with the satisfaction of someone who knows he helped create something that endures. And every time a new crew arrives at Dover, someone tells them the story of the day the nose doors wouldn't open and how an old man in a worn jacket knew the secret that saved the day. If this story moved you, if you believe we should honor those who served and those who built what we use today, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that respect isn't just given to rank and title, but to knowledge, experience, and quiet dignity wherever we find it. Because sometimes the solution to tomorrow's problem is standing patiently at today's fence line, waiting to be asked.